Nigeria's pension industry has grown over the last 18 years since the Pension Reform Act was initially enacted in 2004. The industry has ensured that the average Nigerian worker is able to retire in peace and dignity. The Act brought about the professionalization of pension fund administration and the growth of the pension industry in Nigeria. According to the reports, the bill for an act to amend the Pension Reform Act 2014 to exclude the National Assembly Service from the contributory pension scheme and establish the National Assembly Service Pension Board and for related matters has been passed by the House of Representatives to exempt the National Assembly staff from the contributory pension scheme by establishing a National Assembly Pension Board. The bill was passed for the second time after it was challenged by some lawmakers for breach of due process. The same breach of process for which was stepped down was followed during the passing of the bill in question the second time. There is a concern that this development would throw up agitations by other groups of workers to ask for exemption from the scheme, thereby significantly affecting the future of the scheme. Joining us on the show this morning as we discuss how this bill will affect the future of contributory pension scheme is Johnson Chukwu, Chief Executive Officer of Cowrie Assets, and Oguche Agudah, Chief Executive Officer of Pension Fund Operators Association of Nigeria. Good morning and welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Hi, Chief. It's good to see you. Compliments on the season, and thank you also for joining us, Oguche Agudah. Well, quickly, I would like to ask both of you. Is contributing pension scheme was considered a major innovation in 2014 to protect the interests of future retirees and all of that. But even originally, the military and security services were exempted. Now you have this bill now, the National Assembly saying they want to have their own pensions board. They want to be out of it. The big fear is that if they go ahead with it and that happens, then other groups will want to opt out of it. And that contributory pension scheme will collapse because already prison services, police, they are also saying they don't want to be part of it. What is that major defect in the law as it is that both of you think, is attracting this objection to it by other stakeholders?
All right, thank you, Dr. Ruben Abati, for having me and Seni and every one of you. Let me first by saluting Nigerians Merry Christmas in advance. One of the things I say is that there's certainly no defects in the regulation or the rules that establish the pension fund scheme. What we're dealing with is a tendency of Nigerians not to be responsible for their own welfare. And I'm saying this in the sense of seriousness. Take, for instance, the issue I'm talking about the National Assembly passing a bill to exempt National Assembly staff from the contributory pension scheme. Remember that the contributory pension scheme is basically about, look, you're going to contribute part of your pensionable income, and your employer will also contribute a segment of your pensionable income into a PFA who will invest this fund for your retirement benefit. So if people do not want to contribute, there has been the agitation that they don't want to contribute, which means they don't want to set aside something for their own retirement. They are not ready to make sacrifice for their future. That's, for me, is the crux of the matter. I can understand the government saying, look, we will allow the military to be exempted, in as much as we kick against that. But the reality is that the logic is that these people are putting their lives in danger for the rest of the country. That the government should be able to contribute fully their own pensionable fund. So if you say that, look, a man who takes a gun to fight for the country, you don't need to deduct anything from his pensionable income so as to make allowance, make provision for his future when he retires. That may be understandable. How do you explain that of the National Assembly employees? Again, if the National Assembly is the one making this law, the National Assembly should be, as the lawmaker, should also be the custodians of the law. The National Assembly, Nigerian National Assembly was the one that passed the bill of the Pension Fund Reform Act. And the logic of it is still cannot be faulted. That in the past, people work. Look at where we are as a country today. The government is struggling. Government is not paying salaries in several states. Some states governments are owing 5 months, 6 months salary arrears to start to teachers and some other public servants. So what will be the fate of these people when they are not, the government is not deriving any service from them? Because when you retire, government is not deriving service from you. You can't go on strike because your strike is of no relevance to the government. And then there's nothing set aside. Then whatever is left is an unfunded scheme that the government say, look, you are entitled to receive 50,000 naira every month when you retire. But there is no money set aside for it. And that's why one of the problems we have low life expectancy in the country. Because Nigerians do not have something to look up to. There's nothing that gives a man or a woman confidence that in your old age, there's something there for you that you can live on. Probably one of the reasons why countries like Japan, Norway have some of the longest life expectancy, because the old people know there is something set aside for them. They don't have to go depend on their children or depend on the goodwill of a new government that says, look, we're owing pensioners arrears of pension for 10 months. Okay, we'll pay you 1 month. And they expect you to come and prostrate for them. The reality of the pension scheme is that it was set up so that people who work will live a fulfilled life in their old age. They have something to live on.
Okay, let's go quickly to Mr. Agudah. Mr. Agudah, do you share the same views with High Chief Chukwu here? And then, considering the fact that there are assets involved, if this law is, modified as is being requested, what will happen to existing assets? And did your association, the Pension Fund Operators Administration of Nigeria, did you have the opportunity to make an input into this exercise that is going on in the National Assembly? Because one of the sticky points is that there was no public hearing before, National Assembly members started passing a bill to amend the law.
Thank you, Dr. Ruben. I think the first thing is I totally agree with the High Chief, Mr. Chukwu, on points he made. And just to say that, we were not contacted. There was no public hearing. There was no newspaper adverts. There was no engagement. Even the regulator was not contacted. And I think this is totally out of character from the House. This should not be allowed to stand. It's immoral because they make rules and because it benefits them. As a matter of fact, there are a number of bills before the House currently to amend some aspects of the Pension Act, but it hasn't received any attention. But because this affects them, it's passed speedily. And I think it's very wrong. But just to jump on some of the things Mr. Chukwu said, and one of the things you alluded to is the fact that, the contributory pension scheme, from the way it's structured at the moment, is that when your contributions come, it's not just kept under the mattress or kept in the back, it's invested. And some of these investments are investments in bonds, from which the government borrows, invested in equities, invested in infrastructure, invested in companies. So if we want to exit any group, we'll have to now unwind these investments, lose the value. So it goes against the reason why the scheme was set up. And like Mr. Chukwu said, if the National Assembly passed this act because we wanted to resolve a particular problem of unfunded pension scheme, then why are we now going back? The world is moving towards a contributory pension scheme system whereby as you work, you contribute. But they want to go back to the defined benefit scheme whereby they set up a pensions board to manage the pension scheme. I mean, who is going to be managing that pensions board? Are they professionals there? Are we going to have different regulatory systems? So I think this actually goes back, and there should be a debate around this. For bills to pass without a public hearing, the operators were not contacted, labor was not contacted, the employers were not contacted, the federal government, who they are proposing to debit consolidated revenue fund to get the funds from, were not contacted. So I think this is not the way bills should be passed, and we are not happy with this development at all.
All right, thank you, Mr. Agudah. Now, going back to the question that was asked earlier, Mr. Chief Chukwu, Dr. Abati had spoken about some of the reasons why there's been a call for, first last year, we had the police force also seeking to pass a bill to exempt them, since they mentioned that the military and intelligence organizations, some security intelligence organizations were exempted, and so they felt that there were some issues around the current system. Now, I'd like you to speak to that, especially as some people speak about remittances, which is a big issue around the contributory pension scheme, where it is deducted from staff, but it's not remitted. How do we begin to fix this so that we do not have more groups pushing to be exempted because they feel at the end of the day they are cheated off their hard-earned money that they've been deducted of over the years? And Mr. Oguche, I'd like you to speak to that as well.
Okay, in the first place, if you look at the issues around the lack of Nigerian police asking to be, what the Nigerian police got was they got a closed pension scheme, a closed pension fund. So you have NPF pension fund, which did not really exempt them from contribution, but is now managed as a standalone enclosed scheme for their members. When you talk of the issue of remittance, and some employees may be concerned that maybe their employers do not remit their deductions and the employer's contribution. Yeah, there could be instances of that, but those instances are not as to lead to anybody agitating that the scheme should be balkanized. But most importantly, if you have a scheme that is completely unfunded, which means your employer has no duty to even remit anything or set aside anything in a sinking fund. So the employer makes a book entry and says, look, we know that you'll be entitled to so and so when you retire, but there's no provision for it. It's worse than that your employer has deducted from you and not remitted it. Because under the current regulation, PENCOM will impose penalties for the employer, including interest payment for the unlimited amount. And anybody who does not have a pension certificate will not have access to a government contract or will not be able to access some government facilities, because a lot of times, if you're a private sector operator and you're going to a government entity and you're asking for any form of relationship, among the things they will ask you is to bring your PENCOM certificate to show that you are compliant, you're 100% compliant with deducting from your employees and remitting to a pension fund administrator. So, but the key thing is that you're looking at maybe 1 or 2 or 3 companies or a few companies are in default. And then you want to create a system that will make it even no longer obligatory for those institutions to even deduct or contribute their own. So you are coming from a situation where you have some default and you are moving towards abolishing the process. That has created so much value. And when you talk of the values the pension scheme has created, it's massive. Today, as at the end of October, total assets under management of PFAs is about 14.588 trillion. Call it average of approximately 14.6 trillion. They are the largest pool of fund managers in the country other than the banks. Of the bills that the federal government has sold, of the government borrowing, the federal government has borrowed 9.2 trillion naira from the pension scheme, about 63%. So what we then don't tend to recognize that the macroeconomic benefit of the pension scheme is that we are in a position to, one, fund partly the government, fund the private sector. About 2.1 trillion naira has been lent to corporate in form of corporate bonds. There's companies that borrowed at rates that are lower than what they would have gotten from the banking system. That has gone into productive activities. Those are the things that are at risk. That if we continue in this trajectory, we're going to balkanize the pension scheme. And the truth is that one of the best reforms that was done under the civilian government, the pension scheme.
No. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chuka. I'd like to speak to some of the things you talked about, the pension commission, penalizing organizations. You talked about 1 or 2. Some people might argue with that because unfortunately, where it is not properly regulated, you have defaulters again and again, which a number of people have complained. I'd like you to speak to that, Mr. Oguche.
Yes, thank you. I think just last week, there was actually a report from the Pension Commission that they recovered about 23 billion from defaulting firms. And what happens is that the commission has agents who go around to ensure that the defaulters meet up with their obligations. But then there has to be a part from employees. So there's a whistleblowing policy where if you're working somewhere and your pension has not been deducted, you can also whistleblow and report to the commission, and the commission will set up recovery agents, and they actually took some people to court. So that process is ongoing. But like Mr. Chukwu said, these are few and far between. But if you look at the whole system, and I think, Ayo, you spoke to the point of agitation and people agitating here and then maybe to leave the scheme, some groups. It's typically people from the public service, number one. Number two, there are a number of half-truths being bandied around. And sometimes half-truths, they do more damage than lies. So people look at the military and say, oh, the military is receiving more than me in pensions. But they say if the grass is greener on the other side, then the people over there are probably paying more bills. So we need to x-ray that, if the military is receiving more in pensions because they've exited, it's because they earn more. So the police people, they make a point that, they want to receive as more as the military. But if your salary is not high when you are working, why would your pension be high? So the contributory pension scheme is based on the salary. So one of the things that we have made, recommendations we have made, is to increase the salary, or for your employer, which is the government, to increase the contribution. So with most of the agitations that we hear, no one has said they didn't get their pensions. So we need to isolate the issue. So no one has said they haven't gotten their pensions under the contributory pension scheme. Maybe few and far between because of verification issues. What they are typically saying is that it's not as high enough. So if we agree on that, then we can move forward to say, okay, if the issue is it's not as high, then fine. How do we make it high? You need to contribute more. And I'm preaching the gospel of voluntary contributions. I do voluntary contributions because what Mr. Chukwu was saying is that your pension is your future. And when I speak to pensioners, when I speak to retirees, and I say you can't leave your future to somebody else and say your employer is not paying you more. Whilst you are working, you need to ask yourself, how much should I be putting aside every day so that when I retire, I can have the amount of money I want to do? So people should need to do that. It's not about looking to the employer. What happens in future if the next government comes to say, okay, they can't pay these liabilities? I spoke about half-truths. Last month, the military, some members of the military, they were actually protesting in front of the National Assembly and in front of the Chief of Army Staff. Why? Because their pensions were not paid. So yes, they have a separate board and they have pulled out, but it's dependent on if the person that is signing pays. So we want to go back to the previous scheme where you are bribing someone, it's my turn, pay my pensions. But under the contributory pension scheme, everyone has an account. You can see your RSA, your retirement savings account. You know how much is there. You know how much is contributed. Even if your PFA fails or is acquired, like we've seen recently in some acquisition, your RSA is still there. So the scheme itself should be protected. There might be one or two things that we can tweak. And I always say the largest room in the world is room for improvement. So as lawmakers and as a country, we should be discussing how can we improve this, not how can we use our hands and bring it down. So that's my submission on your question, Ayo.
Good to see you, my brother Agudah, once again. Real quickly, Rafai here anyway. So I'd like to ask you, what are those things we can tweak about the pension scheme? What are those things you really think we should be able to tweak?
Thank you, Rafai. So I think the key thing, as a country, is that we need to look at the collectives, right? So when people retire, they want to buy a house, for instance. They want to buy a car, for instance. They want to send their children to school, for instance, and they say, I need to take that money out. But what we fail to understand is that the ideal thing is not when you're retiring that you should be buying those things. Ideally, those things collectively should be in place, right? So if we have a transport system, if we have an educational system, if we have a health system, so some of the things that we need to be doing is to set the environment whereby pension funds can begin to invest some of these funds for infrastructure development such that everyone has a decent house. And part of the things we are doing is the RSA mortgage. And these are the things we need to be speaking about. Recently, the National Pension Commission brought out guidelines whereby people can use their pensions to be able to fund their mortgage and get their homes. So these are some of the things we need to do. How can pension funds be used for infrastructure development whereby the funding is helping the collective as opposed to individual? So what happens is that one individual wants to take funds out, and they don't care where the money is coming from. Yesterday, the World Bank predicted that next year we will spend 123% of our revenue on debt service. So we are borrowing to service debt, you can imagine. So if we continue to go back to the unfunded system, the system will collapse. So some of the things that I say we need to do is to find ways with the pension system can fund infrastructure in a sustainable way, government guarantees and things like that, but also to encourage people, financial literacy, to begin to voluntarily contribute. For instance, if someone starts work at 25 and you know that I'm going to work for 35 years, you can tell yourself that this is how much I want to get when I retire. I can begin to put some money, more money in my pension pot. Another thing we need to tweak is ability for pension funds to invest offshore and where we diversify and so that the vagaries of the exchange rate does not affect the pension funds negatively. So those are some of the things that I think we should be focusing on and debating as opposed to trying to pull down on people leaving. Thank you, Rufai.
Thank you.
Okay.
How about you, sir? Those things we can tweak, in your own opinion?
Let me start from the things we've done already. In the first place, they introduced a bulk withdrawal option where a retiree can actually make a bulk withdrawal for up to 25% of the amount in the person's retirement savings account. Secondly, they just introduced a scheme that will allow those who have arrested, those who have pension fund, to use part of it to make contribution, equity contribution for mortgages. So which means there's actually be some level of reforms to accommodate the exigencies of life. Like I said, then those who have attained certain age and they lose their jobs, they're also allowed to make some withdrawals from their pension scheme so that, one, if you have a huge contribution, the possibility you can actually start life, even if you want to go into private business, from your from withdrawal or part of your savings is there, and then the rest can be paid you over time. But among the reforms we can look at is that, which had mentioned the issue of, right now the pension fund can invest outside the country, so they are limited to assets within the country, and sometimes those assets are not giving positive return when you compare that to the interest rate in the environment, which means effectively the wealth of retirees are being eroded. Among the things I would suggest in addition to allowing the pension fund to invest outside the country is the issue of increasing what is called the pensionable income. Your pensionable income is your basic salary, your transport allowance, your housing allowance. There are other components of your income that are not pension deductible. So we should apply what we have applied in tax management, in tax deductions, where the tax law has been modified to say, look, it's about your gross income. And your taxable income is now your gross income after making allowances for some, after making provision for some allowances. We have to bring that into the picture so that institutions, because one of the things that people use to circumvent their obligation as employers of labor to make huge reasonable contribution on behalf of their staff is that they make sure that the pensionable income is small, whereas your other incomes are loaded, so they don't have to pay 10% of that addition, the portion that is not part of your pensionable income. So if we now adopt the global income approach and say, look, even if you reduce it from 10%, the employee's contribution, to maybe 7.5%, but the entire remuneration of the staff is what is pensionable. So the employer has to contribute 10% of that entire global income. And then while the employee will also contribute 8% of the global income. So that way you're going to be able to build a larger pool of pensionable assets that employees can basically be assured that when they leave employment, when the old age comes, catches up on them, they have something to live on comfortably throughout the rest of their life.
Well, thank you very much. Hi, Chief Johnson Chukwu, CEO, Cowrie Access. And thank you also very much, Agudah, CEO, Pension Operators Administration.